Before we turn it over to Shayna and introduce her, one of the things I wanted to do to start out this presentation is to give you a little bit of context for the region in which we work, its history, its future, and our commitment to it. And I'm going to read for you a short piece that we wrote for our new strategic plan that our board adopted in June of this year, that I think really helps set the context for the area that we're going to be talking about today, and its first people and the many issues that are involved with that. So I'll just read this, if you'll forgive me. I have not memorized it yet. But long before the arrival of Europeans and the beginning of the Western conservation movement, the greater Yellowstone ecosystem was stewarded by indigenous people who viewed its lands, waters, and wildlife as sacred. The indigenous way of caring for the land acknowledges its life-giving energy, is centered on reciprocity, and uses traditional ecological knowledge to keep the ecosystem in balance. Today, more than 30 tribes, including the Absalica Crow, Cheyenne, Blackfeet, Shoshone, Bannock, Arapaho, and other indigenous peoples, are keepers of this knowledge and retain deep connections to this remarkable place. The forced removal of indigenous people from places like Yellowstone, the loss of indigenous land stewardship practices that resulted, and the continued exclusion of Native voices from the Western conservation movement are realities we must acknowledge and confront. Recognizing and reinstituting these indigenous values, beliefs, and practices is a vital step in restoring the cultural and ecological integrity of the region. The Greater Yellowstone Coalition commits to identifying and fulfilling its role in advancing this paradigm shift. I think given our topic today for this presentation, all of that is especially relevant and appropriate and important to the work that Shayna is going to share with you today. I've had the great fortune of working with Shayna Drimmel for, gosh, close to the past 10 years. Shayna's worked on a number of different wildlife issues, projects, and campaigns. She has a stellar educational background and all kinds of experience, from following grizzly bears around in the wilds of Greater Yellowstone to a lot of work on bison conservation. So I think of her as our in-house expert, and I'm really excited for her to share some of her work and our work at GYC today. So with that, I'll turn it over to Shayna. She's got some slides that she's going to walk us through. And again, if you have questions, just reserve those for the end and drop them into the chat once Shayna wraps up, and I'll moderate those. So take it away, Shayna.
Okay. Scott. Get this situated here. Can you guys see the screen okay? Awesome.
Great.
Okay, so thank you again, Scott, for that introduction. So thank you all for being here today. I'm so excited to be here, and I'm so excited to see you all and share with you some of the work that we are doing at the Greater Yellowstone Coalition. So I am going to start off with a little bit of background on the issue so that everyone knows sort of how we got to where we are today and why we do the work that we do before diving into our vision behind our work and what we're doing to get there. And there will be a couple of trivia breaks throughout that we'll do with y'all just for fun as well. So plains bison were once the most abundant land mammal in North America and perhaps the world. In fact, only 200 years ago, there was an estimated 30 to 60 million plains bison that roamed the grasslands and shrub steppes from Mexico to central Canada. They were considered an ecological keystone species in that their migrations and grazing patterns and behavior literally shaped the physical environment. And perhaps most importantly, they were an inherent part of the cultural heritage and lifeblood of many Native American tribes. As European Americans settled the West in the 1800s, the federal government began a campaign to remove Native American tribes from the landscape by taking away their main food source, bison. And by 1902, after years of intensive market hunting and commercial slaughter, numbers were reduced to less than 24. And the last remaining wild herd of 23 found refuge in the high elevation interior of Yellowstone National Park. So over the last 100 years, bison numbers have increased substantially. There are somewhere around 450,000 bison across North America currently. However, the vast majority are raised in confinement for meat. They're privately owned, they're fenced, and for all intents and purposes could be considered domesticated livestock. Most have some level of cattle gene integration, meaning somewhere along the way they have been bred with cattle, so they are no longer considered genetically pure. And remaining bison only occupy a small fraction of their former range, less than 1% by some estimates. And so many consider them as being ecologically extinct across their historic range. So of the 19 public conservation herds that are currently managed by the Department of Interior across 12 different states, totaling about 11,000 bison, most of these animals are segregated into small isolated herds with only a few hundred animals, leaving them prone to inbreeding and genetic drift and threatening loss of genetic diversity. There is one exception, however, and that is Yellowstone's iconic herd. Yellowstone's bison are truly special and unique. Not only are they the largest population of free-roaming plains bison at about 5,500 animals currently, and many consider them the last remaining truly wild herd of plains bison that is ecologically viable, genetically pure, large, and wide-ranging. They descended from the last wild herd in North America, and Yellowstone is the only place in the US where bison have continuously lived since prehistoric times. And there really is not another bison population which by their sheer numbers restore lost ecosystem processes across a large landscape such as this. Yellowstone bison are also a reservoir of some of the most valuable genetics for the long-term conservation of the species. They're still exposed to a host of natural selection factors such as predation by wolves and grizzly bears, harsh climatic and environmental conditions, and given their large numbers have therefore retained much of their genetic diversity and many of the adaptations that have been lost in other more domesticated or smaller herds throughout the country. This herd also has unparalleled significance to many Native American tribes who see Yellowstone as uniquely linked to their ancestral descendants. In fact, as shown here in this map, there are 30 tribes that have direct cultural and ancestral ties to Yellowstone bison and that consider the lands and resources of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem as being sacred since time immemorial. All right, time for a quick little trivia break. So indeed, Yellowstone bison are culturally and spiritually significant to many tribes across the nation. So to help us remember why they are so important, can you name at least 3 traditional uses of buffalo or bison by indigenous peoples? So go ahead and enter your responses into the chat box.
We have food, clothing, shelter, hides, horns, meat. I think we're all pretty aware that this list could go on a long ways. Ceremony, shelter, clothes.
Nice. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and click this here. So yes, Americans use every part of a buffalo for food, clothing, tools, fuel, utensils, ceremonies. I mean, the list goes on. It's really remarkable. And so thank you for participating. Okay, moving along here. No doubt bison conservation in Yellowstone National Park could be considered a conservation success story in that we've gone from 23 animals to now approximately 5,500. However, this success story has not been without controversy. Bison are naturally a migratory species, and much of their natural winter range exists in the lower elevation valley bottom areas outside of Yellowstone National Park. So as numbers steadily increased over the last century, bison began resuming their natural migratory patterns to try and access these winter ranges outside of the park to the north and west, putting them at the center of an intense and ongoing wildlife controversy. So the dotted line here on this map represents what they believe to be the pre-settlement distribution of bison in this area, which extended well beyond the park to include these winter habitat areas. So as they left the park, bison encountered a changed world, a landscape that had become a maze of development, fenced pastures, houses and highways, and large groups of 1,000 to 2,000 pound animals searching for food can create challenges for people sharing that landscape, both in terms of human safety and because bison want to eat the same grass that ranchers grow to feed their livestock. And then to further complicate things, bison and elk in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem carry a disease called brucellosis. This is a European livestock disease that was introduced into the park in the early 1900s by dairy cows. This disease can be transmitted to livestock and induce abortions or stillbirths in infected animals, and can have an economic impact on ranchers because it can affect the reproductive rate and marketability of their animals. So after years of intense efforts, it has been largely eradicated in livestock throughout the country. However, there still exists this reservoir in greater Yellowstone wildlife. So fears that bison leaving the park will come into contact with livestock on the landscape in Montana and transmit the disease to these animals, in addition to competition for grass, is what drives the heavy-handed management of Yellowstone bison today, even though there has never been a documented case of a wild bison transmitting the disease brucellosis to livestock on the landscape. And in fact, all transmission events that have occurred have been linked back to wild elk. Nevertheless, it's due to these fears that the Yellowstone National Park is forced to cull many hundreds of bison that leave the park every year following the Interagency Bison Management Plan. The IBMP was implemented in the year 2000 following a court settlement after the state of Montana sued the Park Service for allowing bison to enter into the state of Montana. And the idea with the IBMP is to drastically limit Yellowstone bison numbers well below an estimated carrying capacity for the park, as well as their access to lands outside the park in order to maintain spatial separation with cattle to protect the Montana livestock industry. And this has been accomplished primarily through hazing of bison using helicopters and ATVs and horseback. So hazing bison back into the park, as well as rounding bison up as they leave the park and shipping them to slaughter, in addition to the limited state and tribal hunting that takes place just outside the park as well. And since the year 2000, more than 6,000 Yellowstone bison have been sent to slaughter. So what are we doing to change this? Our vision behind much of our bison work is to see Yellowstone bison roaming freely in restored lands outside the park boundary and no longer managed through mass slaughter and hazing. And then on a broader scale, we want to see wild bison restored to tribal and appropriate public lands across North America, ideally using Yellowstone bison. So much of our work over the last couple of decades has focused on securing habitat for bison to use outside of Yellowstone so they can resume some of their natural migratory behavior without being hazed back in or lethally removed. By first focusing on promoting social tolerance for and reducing the potential for conflicts with wild bison on the landscape outside of Montana. And some of this work has included voluntary grazing allotment buyouts and land leases to remove potential cattle conflicts from the landscape. And these are shown here in red on this map. Specifically, this included working with the National Wildlife Federation and other partners to retire the last remaining cattle allotments in the Upper Gallatin portion of the Custer-Gallatin National Forest in 2010, just west of the park here, as well as in the Gardner Basin in 2011. In addition, we were part of a land deal with the Royal Teton Ranch in 2008, where they agreed to retire grazing on their property for 30 years to allow bison to move through their property and access 75,000 acres of public land on the other side. This work has also included ample outreach and education, as well as our Yellowstone Bison Coexistence Program. This is a collaborative effort between GYC, Defenders of Wildlife, the Natural Resources Defense Council, Sierra Club, and Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. The program started back in 2011 and aims to mitigate potential conflicts and concerns over wild bison roaming beyond the park boundary by offering financial and technical assistance to landowners interested in building bison exclusion fences on private property to prevent property damage and keep bison out of potential conflict areas, including gardens, landscaping, yards, playgrounds, and livestock pastures. Since the program began, we have completed 53 projects. This has been a really successful program, a win-win for everyone. And we like to say promoting tolerance for bison one fence at a time. So all of this work has really helped prime the landscape for the return of wild bison and has been absolutely critical to the successful expansion of bison tolerance areas. These are areas where bison are allowed to go outside of the park over the years. So in the last couple of decades, we've gone from essentially zero tolerance for bison outside of Yellowstone. If a wild bison crossed the park boundary, they were hazed back in immediately, or in some cases lethally removed, to now almost 400,000 acres of habitat outside of Yellowstone that we've helped to secure incrementally over the years, where these bison are allowed to roam, and much of which year round. And this has also basically ended the hazing of bison as well. And this map here shows some of those tolerance areas. The yellow portion over here is the northern tolerance area where bison are allowed to go and bulls are allowed to be in that area year round. The purple area is the new west side tolerance area that we helped secure back in 2016. That 250,000 acres of year-round habitat for bison to use. And then the area below that is a seasonal habitat area for bison to use just west of the park. So while we've made great progress towards securing room to roam for bison outside of Yellowstone, many hundreds of bison are still being sent to slaughter every year. In most years, it's somewhere around 500 or so. And this is done to stabilize the population, which is growing exponentially without human intervention. This is in addition to the 100 to 300 bison that tribes remove every winter through treaty rights. So the last several years, we and our conservation partners have been working with Yellowstone National Park, federal and state agencies, and tribal partners, including the Assiniboine and Sioux tribes of the Fort Peck Indian Reservation and the Intertribal Buffalo Council on a way to rehome Yellowstone bison through a new program called the Yellowstone Bison Conservation and Transfer Program. So through this program, disease-free Yellowstone bison can be identified through a multi-step testing and quarantine process, and then used to establish new tribal and conservation herds elsewhere. And this not only serves as alternative to shipping brucellosis-free Yellowstone bison to slaughter to manage their numbers, it supports the culture, economy, and nutrition of Native Americans. It helps preserve the unique Yellowstone bison genome, and ultimately it will help contribute to the conservation and restoration of the species to portions of its native range on public and tribal lands across North America. But because 40 to 60% of these bison carry the disease brucellosis, they cannot simply be rehomed like with other bison herds unless they have first been certified disease-free according to Montana law. So the way the process works is some bison captured during winter roundups as they leave the park are then entered into quarantine rather than being sent to slaughter. The number of bison that can enter depends on how much room there is at the Yellowstone facility currently. So once in the program, animals complete the first 2 phases of testing at the Yellowstone facility, which is near the northern border of the park, or at an APHIS lease facility just down the road near the park boundary. APHIS and the state of Montana health officials then certify bison as brucellosis-free at the completion of the second phase of testing, which takes between 1 and 1.5 years for males and 2.5 to 3 years for females. These bison are then allowed to be transferred to the Fort Peck Indian Reservation, where they complete their final year of what's called assurance testing. And then following this, the Fort Peck tribes transfer some of these bison to the Intertribal Buffalo Council, who distributes them to member tribes throughout North America. The Intertribal Buffalo Council, ITPC, represents more than 70 tribes from 19 different states whose mission is to restore buffalo to Indian country. All right, time for another trivia break. So as we just mentioned, bison spend longer or shorter periods of time in quarantine based on their sex. So now let's see if you can tell the difference between a male, they're also known as bulls, or a female, known as cows. You can either write in the chat box or just think about it for a few minutes. Which photos here you think include a female bison? And I'll just give you guys a minute to think about this a little bit.
Lots of answers here, Shayna, for 1 and 3 have a female.
Nice. Awesome. All right. So yeah, the correct answer is photo 1 and 3. And photo number 3, there's a bull bison in the background, and then there's a cow that's in front there. So for those of you who don't know, you can tell the sex by a couple different ways. I usually use the horns, so you can tell by the size of the base of the horn. Males tend to have larger bases, about twice the size of their eyeballs, and much thicker horns in general. And as bison age, females tend to have more curvature to their horns and will often start to curve inward, kind of like a heart. Younger bulls tend to have horns that stick straight up like ice cream cones, kind of like this guy here in the middle. And then you can also look at the head shape. Female bison have narrower and less triangular shaped heads. And then of course at full size, females are much smaller than males at about half the weight. Males, can weigh about 2,000 pounds, and females typically don't weigh over 1,000. So, all right. Moving on here. Okay, so since the program began in 2018, 154 bison have been certified brucellosis-free and transferred to the Fort Peck tribes, with 82 of those animals transferred onto the Intertribal Buffalo Council and then distributed to 17 member tribes across 9 different states. And here is a map showing the different places Yellowstone bison have gone now through this program. So pretty incredible. And while this is a great start, limited capacity at the Yellowstone quarantine facility, as well as Montana legal roadblocks that inhibit the transport of bison to other facilities outside of the area to go through this process, has significantly limited the number of bison that can enter the program. And many hundreds of disease-free bison are still being sent to slaughter that could otherwise be diverted and transferred elsewhere. So this past year, GYC partnered with Yellowstone National Park and Yellowstone Forever to launch a $1 million one-to-one match capital campaign to raise the funds needed to almost triple the capacity of Yellowstone's quarantine facility. The park committed to providing $500,000 in federal funds toward this effort, with Yellowstone Forever and GYC splitting the difference using funds raised through private philanthropy. The current facility is at capacity, so our goal was to raise this money as quickly as possible by this past spring of 2021, which we did. So this proposed expansion will increase both the number and diversity, which means sex and age class of bison that can be quarantined at the Yellowstone facility. So increasing the number of pens from 2 to 5, adding some necessary water infrastructure, and a new low stress handling corral. So with these additions, we'll be able to increase capacity from entering about 80 animals to about 250 animals over 3-year intervals. This also equates to increasing the number of bison transferred to new areas every year from about 30 bison to 80 bison. Currently, about 70% of program eligible bison that are sent to slaughter due to limited capacity. But this expansion will reduce that number down closer to 10 to 20% and maybe even lower at times. To reduce this down to 0 so that no eligible bison are sent to slaughter would require a larger expansion, which is not possible at this time given the available footprint. And this map here just shows what the new facility is going to look like. So currently, pens 1, 2, and 3 on this map are just two pens. And so they're going to add an interior fence in one of those and turn those into 3 pens and then build 2 additional pens there. So the facility expansion began this past August, and the park has now completed a 4,000 linear feet of new perimeter fence, which has increased the facility size by approximately 20 acres. They're currently working on the water infrastructure improvements right now, followed by the interior fencing, and they are on track to complete all of this by this coming February, at which point they plan to bring in a group of 40 males, a group of 40 females, and another group of 20 females. So that's 100 animals in total that will be diverted from slaughter as a result of this expansion effort. Now, we would really like to see 100% of captured eligible bison be rehomed and to put an end to the slaughter program. So this expansion really is the first step toward a broader, more ambitious vision that includes developing 1 or more additional facilities within the region where Yellowstone bison can be quarantined at multiple locations to create sort of a steady pipeline of brucellosis-free Yellowstone bison that are available for restoration efforts across North America. And we are currently working with our partners at the National Wildlife Federation. I know Jason Baldes is on this phone, that's on this call, so thank you for being here. So we're currently working with them on some plans to develop a potential quarantine facility on the Wind River Indian Reservation as part of GYC's Wind River Buffalo and Water Initiative, which you may have learned about during the last webinar. GYC's Wes Martell is a former Eastern Shoshone business councilman leading this effort, which entails restoring the big Wind River and a buffalo herd of substantial size while tying indigenous culture for both elders and the youth to the restoration of the river and the return of buffalo to the reservation. So with an additional facility on the Wind River or elsewhere, coupled with the Yellowstone facility expansion and improving how bison are hunted outside the park, we and the park believe that it's very possible that the slaughter program will someday go away, and that will be a great day. But beyond diverting brucellosis-free Yellowstone bison from slaughter, I think what is most exciting about this effort for me is the incredible opportunity to be part of a broader conservation effort that includes both the cultural and ecological restoration of the species across North America. There are exciting efforts underway to restore bison to both tribal and non-tribal lands across the continent, and there is a strong desire to use disease-free Yellowstone bison for these efforts, given their strong genetics and cultural significance to many Native American tribes. Growing evidence indicates that most wild bison in this country, including the isolated herds overseen by the US government, are gradually shedding their genetic diversity, making them vulnerable to disease and climate events in the shadow of continued human encroachment. And genetic diversity and adaptive capacity are what enables a species to persist over the long term and in the face of changing environmental and climatic conditions. And so last year, the Department of Interior released a new bison conservation initiative, which provides sort of a framework to the next 10 years of bison conservation on federal public lands, with a new focus on maintaining and increasing the genetic health and diversity of existing herds. And their hope and goal is to do this by augmenting these herds with disease-free, genetically pure Yellowstone origin bison. Tribes and conservation groups are urging or have urged past and are currently urging the present administration to craft a plan to reintroduce bison to the 1 million acre Charles M. Russell National Wildlife Refuge in Montana and on public lands adjacent to the Blackfeet Indian Reservation, including Glacier National Park and the Rocky Mountain Front. And as I just mentioned, our efforts to expand the bison herd on the Wind River Reservation. In addition, there is an ambitious tribal-led initiative to restore bison to 6.3 million acres of tribal and ancestral lands between the United States and Canada, as well as federal legislation known as the Indian Buffalo Management Act under consideration in Congress to secure a permanent obligation of $14 million per year to support tribes in restoring buffalo on tribal lands. This is an effort being spearheaded again by the Intertribal Buffalo Council. So there's just so much momentum and so many exciting projects in the works. So as I start to wrap up, I also want to say that this program is another way that we can give Yellowstone bison more room to roam. A trailer ride to the Fort Peck Indian Reservation and then on to other tribes and public lands to augment or start new herds. It really is the beginning of returning wild Yellowstone bison to the lands where they once roamed and to the native people whom they used to share this landscape with. Many tribes see the restoration of buffalo to their lands as essential to preserving their historical, cultural, traditional, and spiritual way of life. And to native peoples, the return of buffalo represents much needed hope and healing. Entire cultures were intertwined with the great herds that once roamed the continent, and Yellowstone bison represent the last of those wild herds. So the Yellowstone Bison Conservation and Transfer Program is not only history in the making, it's the right thing to do. And I have to say, we are so excited and proud to be a part of this effort. And thank you all for taking the time today to learn about this important work. And with that, I will take some questions.
Great, thanks, Shana. I think we'll hop out of the screen share and let me get my chat box up here and oriented. Before I start jumping into some of these questions, I just want to recognize Jason Baldus, who's been on the call that Shana mentioned, who's really leading the charge for bison restoration down at Wind River with the tribes. And I think we're hoping to be supportive and helpful as those efforts take shape, but Jason and his vision down there has been really exceptional, what he's been able to accomplish. So thanks, Jason. Let's see, I'm going to jump into some questions, and I think most of these I'm going to ask Shana to help with as our bison guru. So Katie asks, what's the total estimated carrying capacity for Yellowstone and bison?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I mean, so that's a really hard thing to estimate when you're dealing with a migratory species. When in conversations with park biologists, their best estimates are that it ranges probably somewhere between 6,000 to 12,000 bison, and that really depends on how many elk there are in the park at the time, and the winter that we're having as well. So it really fluctuates and changes, and it also depends on how much land they have access to outside the park, and whether we're allowing them to migrate and use winter habitat. So it's a tough one to answer, but what I can say is that it's definitely higher than the population target that they've been managing towards through the IBMP. And I will say this too, the park is going to be starting a process to write a new Yellowstone bison management plan this coming winter. And there will be an opportunity to weigh in on trying to increase that population target, which we will definitely be doing. So stay tuned, and if you want to be involved in that, then let us know.
Shana, what about, Robert asks, what about a vaccine in terms of dealing with the disease issues?
Yeah, so there is a vaccine that is used for cattle. It's not that effective, is my understanding. It does work to some extent. The issue with trying to vaccinate wild populations is, well, there's a few issues. One is that you first would have to capture basically all of the bison and all of the elk in throughout the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and or remote, you could also shoot them with like a remote gun, so you can do remote vaccination. But regardless, you'd have to round up a large proportion of animals and vaccinate them, and then you would have to recapture them because they often would require one or two boosters at least. And so the issue with that is that because elk and the GYE carry brucellosis, even if we vaccinated some of the bison, they would just get reinfected because the vaccine is not 100% effective. So it's just logistically, basically, the park studied this and they found that it just wasn't going to be feasible or possible.
A question here from Dawn, and I may need some follow-up to help explain this, but how do you consider the pros and cons of fewer export locations and higher concentration versus larger number of export locations and lower concentration? Could one location become a secondary location for developing disease-free bison?
I'm not sure I totally understand the question. Do you, Scott?
I can, so I unmuted myself. Well, I watched, I think it was fascinating, but it sounded like the exporting was going to a number of locations, and I understand the heritage of the indigenous population who wants bison as part of their overall, how they think about life. But I want in some other parts of life, dispersion isn't always the best way to go versus concentration in fewer locations to build a population. So it's probably an innocent question, but that's what I was trying to get at. It sounded like when you showed the map, there were lots of locations to which they were being exported. Mm-hmm. Is that the best long-term strategy versus fewer locations, building population, and building secondary, clean herds, if I could say it that way?
So do you mean like, focusing more on building like a very large, like a larger population of bison?
Yeah, like you got 5,500, you said, in Yellowstone. So
yeah. Well, I think one of the issues that comes up for me is that, is finding the landscape where that's going to be allowed has been challenging. I mean, there's been efforts to restore bison on the CMR, for example, in Montana. And that's definitely a place where you could restore a large population of bison, but there's been huge political backlash against that. And so we haven't quite gotten there yet. And then the same with the tribes, they're also face their own limitations for, whatever available land that they have. And so it really just depends, we're really just trying to find, places where, tribes have the land base and they're able to take bison and they're ready for that. And then, finding the need and desire from a public land standpoint is challenging.
You kind of addressed this already, the issues around a cure or vaccines for brucellosis. It's unfortunately a pernicious issue in our region, and not easily dealt with through vaccines. I'm going to hop into this next question from Katie. Let's see, I've heard transmission requires overlapping breeding grounds and timelines. Is that true? And then a follow-up, several years ago, quarantine animals were released by other parties. What happened to those animals?
Yeah, so the answer to your first question is yes, that's correct. There's a very specific transmission period, and that's during calving, basically, or in the time period before calving, when females might abort their fetuses. So it's transmitted through aborted fetuses typically on the landscape. So yeah, it's just kind of a few months time period. And then, you know, the length of time that that bacterium will stay on the landscape really depends on the temperature outside and how much sun exposure. But studies have found that typically that bacteria is non-existent in the natural environment after, I believe it's June, early June.
Mm-hmm. And then this question, Shayna, about the animals that were released from quarantine a few years ago.
Which animals?
I assume, Katie, you're talking about the animals that people cut the fence at the facility and released before they were able to be transported to the tribes. Yeah.
So are you asking what happened to those animals?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think they became, you know, they were set free and just kind of went back to intermingling with the rest of the herd. And so I don't know if they were ended up being taken through the hunt or rounded up and shipped to slaughter, or they ended up just going back into the park. It's, you know, any one of those are possible scenarios for those animals, but it was actually pretty, you know, it was pretty too bad that that happened because they had already gotten a good way through the process. So it's kind of sad.
Question here about who manages bison on public land. So do you support management by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who manage bison for all Americans, while tribes have the freedom to manage their own tribal herds?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on what lands bison are on. That's who management responsibility is going to fall to. So, you know, in Montana, bison that use Forest Service lands are managed by Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, and as well as, unfortunately, the Department of Livestock, because they have a disease, brucellosis. Yeah, we absolutely support the tribes managing their own herds, and we would even support a novel co-management situation between the federal government and the tribes on public lands as well.
I think in a situation like getting bison to the to refuges, whether that's the CMR in central Montana or others, you know, clearly Fish and Wildlife Service would have a role there. And in other places where there are bison on public lands, like down in Utah, the Book Cliffs or the Henry Mountains, you know, you've got a situation where the state and then the public land management agencies are managing those animals. I think, you know, one of the challenges that we have here in Montana that Shayna alluded to was that issue of the Department of Livestock being involved in the management equation, which is a challenge, clearly.
Yeah, and that's only for bison leaving Yellowstone. So the public lands that bison access outside of Yellowstone, because those are bison that have brucellosis, the Department of Livestock is involved in their management. It's typically not the case elsewhere.
Question here from Ash, Shayna, can you briefly speak to why elk are allowed to roam free outside the park and bison are not? This is the question that comes up over and over and over again that defies all logic.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we all ask ourselves, right? I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, I think it honestly comes down to the fact that there's more, you know, there's more social acceptance for elk as a very highly coveted game species. So the sportsman constituent, they would never be okay with, you know, elk being basically sent to slaughter, leaving the park. Many elk migrate from the park to areas north and west of the park and are hunted through our state wildlife hunt. So I think it really comes down to that. I mean, bison may compete a little bit more directly with cattle for grass. They are primarily grazers, and elk, can be browsers as well. So, but in general, I think it really comes down to the fact that there's just, there's more tolerance for elk.
Leslie, thanks for this question. How can we average citizens help to see GYC's vision implemented? There's a couple of things that Shana spoke to that would be fantastic. One, if you're not already a financial supporter, please consider supporting this work. Two, Shana referenced upcoming plan that the Yellowstone National Park is working on to change their bison management. That's going to be really important that people engage with and pay attention to and weigh in on. There's also pressure that we can all collectively apply on the state of Montana and their policies, whether that's during the legislative session up in Helena or in other settings, working directly with the state's Fish, Wildlife, and Park Agency. It's going to take a lot of pressure to change things. I mean, GYC has worked on bison conservation since our founding in 1983. And we'll continue to be working on it for a long time, I'm sure, and it will be slow change. Also, this bigger, broader vision, is not just GYC's. All of our partners, partner organizations, tribal partners, and others play a huge role in this. If you want to learn more about what's going on down at the Wind River Reservation, get in touch with Jason and Baldus. We can talk with you more too about efforts in Congress, the Indian Buffalo Management Act that's in play, or Department of Interior's Bison Initiative as well. There's a lot of moving pieces to this, and it's much bigger than GYC. We're trying our best to play, a helpful, effective role in all of this, but it's big, and anything you can do to support it financially, politically, with on-the-ground projects, whatever it is, we'd love to chat with you more about it. But there's a lot to do here, clearly. A question here from Robert: is there a plan to engage cattle ranchers and farmers in Montana that explains these bison initiatives to deal with the political backlash?
We've attempted to engage with a lot of ranching folks and people in the ag communities, with some success, especially in the communities around the park. There are some folks that are more and more open to kind of a shared landscape vision. But there are other people and especially folks kind of in the, as we move away from Yellowstone area, that, we're really having a hard time kind of reaching to and kind of getting their support and understanding. So it's been a challenge, but we're trying to get there.
This next question kind of dovetails with the last one. And how about sending bison to the American Prairie Reserve? This is one of those places in the state where there is a lot of challenging opposition to bison restoration and just to the effort up at the reserve. And that is showing up in our legislature and in different policies enacted by the state. And of course, that's hundreds and hundreds of miles from Yellowstone, but it has an impact on Yellowstone bison and what the park can and can't do, and what the tribes, what the tribes are looking to do in their vision. So it's challenging. Shana, I don't know what you would add to that.
Yeah, it's super challenging. And I guess I'll just say that, there isn't a shortage of, tribes, for example, that are wanting Yellowstone bison. And in fact, right now I feel like, folks are sort of like lined up, waiting for these bison. And so, the pinch point has been sort of the timing that it takes to get them through this process, and the infrastructure constraints that we've had at the Yellowstone facility. And then, like I said, needing maybe another facility developed at some point so that we can get more bison moving through. But there's just a long line of tribes that sort of are waiting for Yellowstone bison at this point. And so it's not really a lack of like finding a place to send these bison. It's more like, how do we get more of them diverted from slaughter and into this process?
A couple of questions here, Shayna, about how bison respond to the quarantine process and then being relocated. Any impacts to their sort of how they operate on the landscape due to the quarantine and transport?
Yeah, I mean, that would really be a question for, I would think, Chris Jeremiah with Yellowstone National Park. But what I can say is that they're really taking very seriously this whole concept of low stress handling. And in fact, they've worked with Temple Grandin, I believe, and another like low stress handling expert. I'm forgetting the name. I don't know if you remember, Scott, but they've brought in a bunch of folks to work with over the years and are really taking very seriously, not to handle these bison too much and to do every time they have to work with them to test them, it's in a very gentle way. They don't go near them. They're letting them be out there. And so they're really trying to preserve their kind of wild nature, if that makes sense. And I have not heard that these bison are turning sort of domestic and are changing their behavior after this process.
A nice comment here from Ash that I just want to read because I think it's spot on. But she said, I want to encourage everyone to visit Fort Peck and see firsthand their enthusiasm and deep passion for their buffalo quarantine facilities. They have over 20,000 acres for the bison who are sent there, and it is really amazing to see their new life. The people have a lot of wisdom to share about bison meaning and management. And that is very true. Thanks for highlighting that. I think just the knowledge that's been developed with the tribes at Fort Peck, and now the work that Jason's leading on Wind River and in other places of just how to run really effective programs, and this vision of expanding the amount of landscape that these animals have available for them is just really exciting and inspiring. And this program obviously can play a really important role in that, but they need a place to go where people are knowledgeable and committed, and the tribes are really leading in that space right now, which is fantastic. I think I have arrived at the bottom of our questions, which is great because it's about 5 o'clock. I want to thank everybody for joining us this afternoon. If you have additional questions regarding this program or any of our work, please get in touch with me or Shayna or any of us here at Greater Yellowstone Coalition. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. For those of you that are already supporting our work, thank you so much for that. The opportunity to raise funding quickly to expand the program with the Park Service and to support other bison conservation efforts is only because of you. So thank you for that. And have a great night, everybody. Stay tuned for more of these opportunities. We've had really great turnouts over the last couple of months as we've been doing these, and it's just been great to see people tuning in from all over the place. So thanks again for your support, and I hope to see you soon, either on a screen or even better in person somewhere.
Thank you all. It was so great to chat.